Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project. My name is Chris Akers, and on this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, and sport, and anything else we can think of. Now, today's guest, I've read his brilliant book, which is Brick City Grudge Match. And everyone who knows me and knows my rights, I'm a big fan of boxing, and I'm a big fan of his trilogy here regarding Rocky Graziano and Tony Zale. The person who wrote this is Rod Honecker, and he's here with me today. Hello, Rod.
Hey Chris, how you doing?
I'm very well, extremely well. So before we get into the trilogy and what else you mentioned in the book, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what made you, well, first of all, where your love of boxing started, and also what was it about this trilogy that made you think I want to write a book, you want to write a book about it?
Yeah, so I've lived my whole life in New Jersey. My mother's side of the family was from Newark, New Jersey, and Newark is the biggest city in New Jersey even to this day. My grandfather was a detective in the Newark Police Department, and he actually worked the third Zale Graziano fight, which took place in Newark. So I always had some knowledge of this fight, and my grandfather also is the person that introduced me to boxing. He was a big boxing fan. He actually attended the first $1 million gate fight, which was Jack Dempsey versus Carpentier, which took place in Jersey City, New Jersey, back in the early 1920s. And when I was growing up, I'm 60 years old now. Growing up in the 1970s, boxing was still a top flight sport. Muhammad Ali was the biggest star, of course, the heavyweight champion. His fights were on regular TV, all the time. The fight he had, the first fight with Joe Frazier that was not on free TV. That was a pay-per-view event because it was just such a monstrous sporting event. And then the lighter weight classifications had a bunch of star fighters, Bob Foster, light heavyweight, middleweight into the 80s, a guy like Marvin Hagler and, Roberto Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard, Alexis Arguello. The heavyweight division was stacked. So, that's where I, became a boxing fan. And then in terms of the book and what triggered it, people ask me that. I don't really have a spiffy type response, but I think, having the knowledge that my grandfather told me, he had been to this fight, and being a boxing fan, I heard of Zale and Graziano, the trilogy. I read a book on the history of Newark, and the author made the point that the population of Newark peaked out in 1948, which was the same year as the fight. And I thought that was interesting. And then the more I thought about it, I thought this could be an interesting book, talking about the fight, the fighters, the trilogy, but also the city of Newark at that time, and how it was doing at the time, and how it got to that point, and how it developed after that. I'm an attorney, and I went to law school in Newark, so I have some connection to the city.
Okay. So you mentioned about Newark and New Jersey. Was it true that this is just before the trilogy, in fact, a couple of decades before, was it true that there were certain prohibitionists who were actually trying to stop boxing in that particular state?
Yes, boxing was actually illegal in New Jersey until 1918. They actually, on occasion would prosecute people, but mostly it was the authorities sort of turned a blind eye toward it. Boxing matches were held in strange locations, on barges and in barns and places where the authorities might not hear about it. But technically, the sport was illegal until 1918 when they changed the law. And that would actually the timing was fortuitous for New Jersey boxing, because boxing in New York and New York City at the time was still illegal. As a result, New Jersey got landed a lot of very big fights early on, and including the Dempsey Carpentier fight that I just mentioned. And a tradition sort of developed that the fighters would earn their spurs over in New Jersey before going on to a bigger stage. So there were a lot of big fights and a lot of really good boxers from New Jersey.
So the law you're talking about in regards to 1918, was that the Hurley Boxing Act or Hurley Boxing Law? Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it was Joseph Hurley who came up with that. What are the reasons for making that law? Because obviously you had a lot of people who wanted it banned. So what was his reasons for actually bringing that law to fruition?
Yeah, part of it was that it was it wasn't strictly enforced in any event, and the authorities thought it was much like with marijuana now that everybody's doing it. Why punish particular people who get pinched? It just seemed unfair. But I think the bigger factor was World War I. The guys had been sent over to Europe, and many died, others were maimed. They really risked their lives, and as in some cases cannon fodder, and they enjoyed boxing as a sport, entertainment, and it was thought to be unfair to deprive the veterans of an entertainment that they enjoyed after risking their lives for the country.
So isn't it true that Theodore Roosevelt, just before that law was established, actually stopped boxing being banned in his was it New Jersey as well?
No, he was in New York, and he was the police commissioner in New York City before he became governor, and then before he became vice president and president. And he refused to enforce the law. He thought boxing was a healthy endeavor for young men to engage in. And he was a sickly youth himself, and he used boxing training to improve his own health and conditioning. And he thought it was a very positive thing for young men to be involved in. He even advocated that colleges, should have boxing teams, which many did back at that time.
So let's get on now. We've established it's become legal in New Jersey. So let's establish the two protagonists of your book. So first of all, we start with Tony Zale, obviously from Gary, Indiana, known as a Man of Steel. What was his because Zale isn't his real name, it's more anglicized name. So what was his background and how did he get into boxing?
Yes, his real name was Zaleski. He was from a large family. He was the sixth child. His parents emigrated from Poland, and they located in Gary, Indiana, as you said. Gary, Indiana, at the time was, along with Pittsburgh, the steel making capital of the United States. U.S. Steel had a huge factory there, and his father worked there, and Zale's older brothers worked in the steel factories. I think the defining fact of Zale's early life was when he was 2 years old, his father was killed by a drunk driver, and his father was actually killed while he was out on a bicycle going to the pharmacy to get medicine for Tony Zale, for Anthony, who was only 2 years old at the time. His father's death had an impact on him in the sense that he became quite a painfully shy youth, but he was a very good athlete. Just to take a step back, the father's death at that time, you can imagine what a challenge it posed to the family with six children. Zale's mother had to become basically the breadwinner, which he did as a maid, and his older brothers went to work in the steel mill to keep everything afloat. Zale was a very good athlete. He was a very good football player. He was offered a scholarship by the University of Wisconsin, an explosive running back. But his real love was boxing. His older brothers got into the sport around the time Dempsey was quite a phenomenon in the early 1920s, very popular. The sport was accepted as a mainstream sport with a lot of publicity that, primarily generated by Dempsey. And, Zale, Tony Zale, soon began outstripping his brothers, who were good amateur fighters. But it became clear pretty quickly that Tony was the best of the lot, and the older brothers actually started begging off of sparring sessions with their younger brother, because he was tough, and he really he enjoyed it. He was one of those fighters who liked to train and just enjoyed the entire the physical and mental aspect of boxing. Zale took his name, Zale. He actually followed his older brother's example in this as well. The Zale family was very religious Catholics. Their priest got wind that the Zaleski brothers were boxing and expressed his disapproval. They wanted to continue boxing, so they changed their name. They shortened their name to Zale. And in addition, that was sort of like an Anglification of the name, which was quite a common thing for immigrants to do at the time, especially from Eastern Europe. As I said, Zale was a talented boxer and a very good amateur boxer. He almost almost represented the United States in the 1932 Olympics. Fell just short. He was cut and lost the fight due to the cut. And because of the cut, which was over his eye, he underwent sort of a gruesome medical procedure where they filed down his forehead, believe it or not. And but as primitive as it sounds, it actually worked. He never lost another fight due to cuts.
I think that's just brutal. Must be an easier way of doing it now, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's just brutal, very brutal. And you brought up there the 32 Olympics, you almost got into that team. Whenever I've seen about Tony Zale, seen a documentary which happened to be part of, they describe his teak toughness, which he was. Obviously, Man of Steel, in many respects, he was steel-like. But would you argue that his boxing ability was actually underrated, that he's sometimes seen as almost teak tough, and that was it?
Yeah, I would. His career arc was sort of strange. I mean, he was an outstanding amateur fighter, but he didn't make the Olympics. And then he turned pro, and the early phase of his career was really quite disappointing. He suffered several knockout losses, and his managers lost interest in him. And he actually retired for a year and a half or so before he went back into the ring. And even then, it wasn't like a straight shot to the top. It was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think the finished version of Tony Zale, the Tony Zale that won the title against Al Hostak and defended it, several times. And then before the war intervened, he was fighting some very good fighters, Georgie Abrams, and he was taking them. And then when you listen to his opponents discuss his fighting abilities, they all talk about his toughness. That's true. He was a good puncher, but he also was more skilled than given credit for. He was not that easy to hit. Both Billy Conn said that, and Graziano, and he knew what he was doing in order to maximize his own gifts.
Yeah. So we've moved on from Zale. Now I've got Graziano. And whereas Zale suffered from tragedy, he was basically almost, for the most part, on a straight and narrow. Graziano, on the other hand, that was a whole different kettle of fish. Can you explain about his upbringing and what led him to get into boxing?
Yeah. So Rocky Graziano, real name Rocco Barbella, was born in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which at the time was known for being a very rough neighborhood and impoverished. And his family was particularly impoverished. Rocky's father was a former boxer, but not a very good one. He was an alcoholic. He beat his children and his wife, Rocky's mom. So it was pretty much a hellish existence. They lived in a tenement at the top floor without any hot water. The father would send Rocky out to steal coal in order to feed the potbelly stove, which was the only heat they had. The father would pit Rocky in boxing matches against his older brother, who was 3 years older than them, and have them beat the heck out of each other. So it was a pretty ugly existence. Rocky reacted like I think a lot of boys do when they're in that kind of difficult situation. He became a truant. He quit school in 6th grade. He was involved in, at first, petty thefts, that kind of thing, but that escalated into muggings and more serious real crimes. And he also liked to party. So he was just basically a wild man. The system got a hold of him pretty early when he was about 11 years old, and he was basically in the system, reformatories and then later prisons from the time he was 11 until his early 20s. He really didn't start boxing until later, and it was just a way to make some money. As far as he was concerned, he initially never dreamed of it as being a way for him to make a living. But the final sort of chapter in his wayward youth was he was drafted into the Army, and he was not a good fit for the Army. He did not react well to authority. So when the sergeant or whatever, they blow reveille, he was not interested in getting up and marching. And so one thing led to another. And then finally he's in the office of an officer who is reaming him out, and Rocky plants a straight right on the officer's jaw and knocks him out cold. And he runs away. He goes AWOL. He changes his name as a way of trying to, hide from the authorities. But he also starts boxing more. Finally, they track him down. The Army tracks him down. They pinch him and send him to a military prison, Leavenworth Prison out in Kansas, which was a terrible place. But that is where he meets a boxing coach who convinces him to get more serious about it. And it really works out for Rocky. He had the talent, especially a powerful right hand. By boxing and by being good at boxing, he suddenly becomes a favorite of the officers. So he goes from being an outsider and somebody who the authorities just can't stand. He sort of becomes a favorite, and eventually he does his time and he gets released. And then he comes out and then he starts boxing professionally.
So how did his career start professionally? What was he like? Was he rising through the ranks, or was it like Zale, where he lost a few, won a few?
Yeah, similar to Zale, won a few, lost a few. He could be outboxed. He was a sort of a crude wild man. He did not like to train, unlike Zale. He just viewed boxing as a way to make money, basically. But a turning point occurred a few years into his career. He got a shot to fight in Madison Square Garden, and although he was a big underdog against a fighter named Arnold, he was 6-1 underdog. He was losing on points. Rocky suddenly exploded and won by a knockout, and it sort of caused a sensation. And then he went on a spectacular knockout run, mainly against welterweights. Rocky's was small for a middleweight, but weighed too much to be a welterweight, 147 pounds welterweight, middleweight maximum 160 pounds. He was about 154 pounds. So he made his reputation knocking out welterweights, but he worked his way through, all the top welterweights other than Sugar Ray Robinson. He knocked out Red Cochran. He knocked out, I think 3 former welterweight champions, all at Madison Square Garden, the biggest arena, maybe in the world, but certainly in the United States. And he was very popular. He just caused a sensation with his sort of wild style. I mean, he frequently was behind on points and then would come back with a tremendous rally. And it generated a tremendous buzz. People thought that his talent had really emerged, and he could really become a champion and a fighter that could really carry boxing in terms of his popularity and his personality, which the press loved. He was sort of a wild man, but funny and very likable in an interesting way.
Did he actually headline Madison Square Garden a few times? Because from what you're saying, he was a crowd pleaser, and I know he fought there, but was he a big headliner at that arena?
Absolutely, yeah. He's one of the most popular fighters ever to fight at Madison Square Garden. He that's why he's known today. That's why he's I think in the International Boxing Hall of Fame. It's his popularity and his personality. And I know we'll probably talk about his post-boxing career, but he was a tremendous success as an entertainer and a pitchman after he retired.
So getting up to the first fight, Zale was a champion, I believe, and then you had Graziano as a challenger. What was, in like the last year, 18 months of Graziano's career before that first fight with Zale, what was his career like? Because I imagine obviously he was winning, but what was the caliber of his opponents that he was beating up until that point?
Yes, he was basically knocking out all of these former welterweight champions, and that's what gave him the shot. And to go back to Zale for a minute, Zale won the title shortly before World War II, or at least the United States' involvement in World War II. And he wins the title. He really doesn't get a chance to capitalize on it in terms of making any money. Pearl Harbor gets bombed. Back at that time, celebrities and athletes were expected to serve in the military. And the boxers were no different. Joe Louis, heavyweight champion, went in to serve in the United States Army, and Zale signed up for the Navy. So Zale was inactive for 4 years. He didn't see action. He was a physical fitness trainer mostly. He spent most of his time down in Puerto Rico. But the boxing authorities froze all of the titles and the champions in place. I imagine they thought it would have been unfair to strip people of their title when they're serving their country. But finally, World War II ends, and the boxing authorities tell all the champions, all right, now you're either going to retire, because in Zale's case, he was quite old at this point, because he took him a long time to climb the ladder. And they said to Zale, you either got to schedule a title fight or retire and let these other guys who had come up and through the ranks during this time, including Jake LaMotta, Charlie Burley, another great fighter. The middleweight division was loaded. And Zale was presented with the option of who he wanted to fight. And he said, I'll fight Graziano. Graziano was considered the best draw, especially for a fight in New York City. And the fight was scheduled at Yankee Stadium. And at the time it went off, Rocky was a big favorite. Zale was, he had won the title right before he went into the Navy, but he wasn't particularly well known, especially in New York. He was more of a Midwestern product. He was respected, but they considered him colorless and really nothing extraordinary.
Yeah, just some of the names that you spoke of there in terms of the middleweight era, which you could argue is a bit of an underrated time for the middleweight division. So obviously you've got Tony Zale, Rocky Graziano, Jacob LaMotta, Marcel Sedan, Charlie Burley. There's probably others I can't think of right now. Just seems like the top 10 seemed, I imagine, was a very in-depth middleweight division at that time.
Absolutely. I mean, Holman Williams, another outstanding middleweight. I'm trying to think of others, but if you look at the ratings of the top 10, it's a deep rating, a very deep division. You mentioned Marcel Cerdan from France. He was a great fighter. I mean, he only lost 3 close decisions and was never knocked out. LaMotta had all the credentials. He fought the great Sugar Ray Robinson 6 times. He only won once, but he had a couple of other close matches with him. Robinson himself was at the time a welterweight, but it was known that he had his eyes on the middleweight division. He had cleaned out the welterweight division, and there was a lot of chatter about him moving up and fighting as a middleweight. And Charlie Burley is a whole story in himself, and the so-called Black Murderers Row. There were a bunch of excellent black fighters that really weren't given a chance at the time. I cite to a couple of books in my book that tell the story of these guys, how they were left to fight each other because a lot of the other fighters just didn't want to mess with them. There was, there were canards at the time that, that black fighters couldn't draw at a Madison Square Garden. There were various excuses used for why they were not, given the shot, when it was quite obvious from their records that they were ranking, with the other fighters. But in any event, the division was packed, and many people, including Ring Magazine, the Bible of Boxing at the time, really didn't think Zale was the best middleweight. He won the title and he was respected, and he certainly was the champion. But I think the consensus was that once he got back from the Navy, he would get knocked off pretty quick and then fade into obscurity.
Yeah, so going into that fight, which I don't think there's any footage of it, is there, or very little, sadly. Obviously, like you said, Graziano was an overwhelming favourite, and from the reading of the book, correct me if I'm wrong, but the early stages of the fight, based on descriptions we have, he actually seemed to be beating Zale.
Yes, yeah. So they fight in Yankee Stadium. They set a record for the gate for a non-heavyweight bout. Zale knocked Graziano down in the first round, but it was sort of a flash knockdown. Then Rocky took control of the fight. It looked like he was going to knock Zale out at several occasions, especially at the end of the second round. He floored Zale, and Zale was essentially saved by the bell. Zale broke his hand in the second round, so his right hand, so he was handicapped by that. He was really taking a battering. And between the 5th and the 6th rounds, the referee almost stopped the fight, and observers, including Nat Fleischer of Ring Magazine, turned to the guy next to him and said, well, it's a shame. It's going to be over soon. Zale's really put up a good fight, but it's over now. Then in the sixth round, Zale hit Graziano with a right to the body, followed by a quick left hook to the jaw, which was Zale's sort of classic combination. And they counted Rocky out. He didn't seem like he was knocked out. He was sort of in a fog, and he jumped up a split second too late, but he was counted out, and the fight was over.
So Zale's won against all the odds. Graziano, what was his reputation like after that fight? Because he was winning it and then unexpectedly went out. So how was he seen in the eyes of not just supporters, but the boxing media at that time after that first fight with Zale?
Yeah, the fight was so exciting, and it was deemed the fight of the year in 1946. And as you mentioned, there's no film of it, unfortunately. It was actually televised, and was a primitive era of television. There's no video as far as I can tell. I don't believe the technology at the time utilized video, but in any event, there's no film. So we're just left with the contemporary descriptions, and the reaction to the fight was overwhelmingly positive in terms of the excitement it generated. I should mention it came on the heels of the second Joe Louis-Billy Conn fight. Billy Conn had almost upset Joe Louis immediately prior to the war. So there was a clamoring for them to have a rematch after the war was over, but it was a severe disappointment. Joe Louis was showing signs of age, and Conn was terrible. He was overweight and was not the fighter that he was before. So there was people really down on boxing, and Zale and Graziano lifted everything back up, and everybody was very grateful to the two of them in the boxing community for doing that. Rocky's reputation, it sort of went two ways. People thought he put on a great show, but there was a question of whether he had the real championship fiber to be able to climb to the top. People felt he should have won, and he sort of threw it away. And the first time Zale really sticks it to him good, he gets counted out. So people were questioning his guts. Even there were some accusations that he had thrown the fight. There was no evidence that was the case. But he suffered for it, and especially in his neighborhood, because a lot of people had bet money on him. And these people were working class people. They didn't have a lot of money to lose, and for him to let him down like that was tough. And he tells a story where he'd be walking down the street in his neighborhood, and people he'd known for 20 years would go across to the other side of the street. So it was a tough time for him.
Yeah, I'll bet. So how long, what was the gap between the first and second fight? Like how long after the second fight?
Yeah, so the first fight was in September 1946. And then the second fight was in June of 1947. So the boxing community and the fans wanted a rematch. It was such an exciting fight. But something occurred in the interim between the two fights that really threw things into chaos. And that was that Rocky lost his license to fight in New York, his home state. And the reason was that he had been scheduled to do a fight with a guy named Cowboy Shank, who was a journeyman, not in Rocky's class. And the betting odds before the fight went crazy. Suddenly Cowboy Shank was favored to win the fight. So the regulators, the authorities, thought there's something going on here. This might be a fixed fight. Next thing we know, Rocky says his back is hurt and he can't go through with the fight. Next thing the authorities learned that someone had approached Rocky about throwing the fight. Rocky, of course, didn't agree to throw the fight, but the theory was that he backed out of the Cowboy Shank fight for fear that he might upset, the person who's offering the bribe, who might be an organized crime figure or something like that. the suspension, the technical reason for the suspension was that Rocky hadn't reported the attempted bribe to the authorities, which was the rule at the time. But Rocky Rocky denied knowing who the person was who made the bribe offer, which nobody believed. But in any event, New York suspended Rocky's license, so he couldn't fight in New York. They were going to fight in Madison Square Garden. That didn't happen. The other states, though, still had Rocky licensed, and they managed to put together a deal for the second fight at Chicago Stadium in the city of Chicago. And that fight was another commercial success. It set the record for an indoor gate at the time, and that became the fight of the year for 1947.
So get to the second fight now, and in a way it's the inverse of the first fight, in that Zale's boxing is doing well, and then again, he's all from reviews of the fight reports at the time because of the little footage. And then suddenly, I think it might have been the same round, the sixth round, suddenly the fight just changes like that.
Exactly. Yeah, Zale was carrying the fight. He really was giving Rocky a battering. He closed one of Rocky's eyes. The other eye was bloodied by Zale. It was tremendously hot in the arena in that June day in Chicago. And round about the fifth round, Zale started to fade. And Rocky said it dawned on him that Zale couldn't hurt him anymore. And Rocky just went on the attack and started battering Zale toward the end of the fifth round. And then in the sixth round, he really teed off on Zale, landed over 30 blows in succession. He folded Zale draped him over the rope, and the referee finally had to step in to stop the slaughter. And Rocky was the middleweight champion of the world. He was given the microphone after the fight and said something to the effect, "Hey, Ma, your bad boy did good," which is sort of a famous line in boxing lore, and is the climax of the movie they made about Rocky after he retired. Somebody up there likes me.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that movie in a minute because there's a big part that Zale plays in that. But obviously, he's middleweight champion of the world now, Graziano. His celebrity, I imagine, must have gone through the roof. Can you discuss both Graziano, what his reputation is like, not just in boxing, but in America as a whole, American culture, and also Zale, because obviously he was getting on a bit now and he's just lost a fight like that. So can you talk about the contrasting fortunes between the two of them after that second fight?
Yes, yeah. Zale was a very quiet, shy man, I mentioned. He didn't generate a lot of buzz, but he was very respected. I think he sort of fit the notions that 1940s America had of how an athlete, a celebrity, should behave. He was very, very low key. He was a married man. By all outward appearances, he was. He put the straight and straight-laced. I said, and his reputation was such that he claimed no one ever even approached him to throw a fight. That I know that relates to boxing, but I think it illustrates the type of person he was and the type of esteem that he was held by working class Americans in particular. Rocky, on the other hand, especially in the wake of World War II and his service record, did not have that kind of respect. There was quite a bit of bitter feeling toward him for not serving, for basically going AWOL and bugging out. And that, in my research, that really came through in some of the sports writers' comments. They really carried a grudge toward him, and you got the impression that there were a lot of, fans who felt the same way. There were some comments, some really nasty comments about him. And even though he was very popular as a fighter, there was also he had a lot of people who didn't like him a lot. Somewhat similar to Muhammad Ali later. When he refused induction into the army in the Vietnam era, a lot of people held that against him. But in terms of generating excitement, definitely Rocky was the guy. You can tell from, or one of the things I saw in my research was people were very happy Rocky won the title. They thought that would be very good for boxing, just because he was a fascinating character and would generate a lot of excitement.
With him not fighting in the war, going AWOL, Graziano, and obviously people in society not liking that, I imagine that's the prevailing, like I said, the prevailing attitude of the time, because didn't that happen with Jack Dempsey as well?
Yes. Yeah, the Dempsey's situation was a bit different. That didn't, his war record and lack of service didn't really come out until after he had won the title. And but his reputation suffered for it as well. It wasn't until Dempsey lost to Gene Tunney that people sort of forgave his checkered war record. I can imagine at the time, if people had their lives disrupted by the war, and maybe they had lost family members or they had been injured. It's not totally irrational for somebody like that to have a bit of a grudge against someone who didn't serve, who was young and single. He really didn't have a good excuse. He just, was a wild man and didn't like authority,
Okay, cool. So we've got this third fight. I imagine the demand of it was high because it's 1-1 now. This took place in New York, is that correct?
Right. So this is the focus of my book, the third fight, which takes place in Newark, New Jersey. It's an odd location for a fight of such magnitude. It was, by this point, New Jersey and Newark in particular really was not a hotbed of boxing. It still had held a lot of fights, but it was sort of like the minor leagues for New York City. The fighters earn their chops over in New Jersey, and then if they prove themselves worthy, they got a shot at Madison Square Garden. But because of Rocky's licensing situation, it sort of opened the door for Newark to land the fight. I mentioned earlier that he lost his license in New York first, and he remained suspended for 4 years, I think it was. It was quite a long time. After he won the title against Zale in 1947 in Chicago, other states suspended his licensing as well, including Illinois after the fight, including Florida, which was referenced as another potential site for the third fight. So that opened the door for New Jersey. The thinking was, well, we'll license him and we'll be able to host the fight. And it's a huge fight, and that'll help, generate interest back in boxing again, and in Newark, the city of Newark. At that time, Newark was starting to show some signs of decline in the sense that the city had always been a big manufacturing center. World War II contracts really helped the city. As I mentioned earlier, 1948 was the peak population. But as the war contracts started burning off, the factories started closing. Also, there was a trend where factories were moving to the south of the United States where there were no unions, out to the west of the United States where there was better infrastructure, lower taxes. So the city was showing signs of decline from that standpoint. Another thing I talk about quite a bit in the book is the influence of organized crime in New York City, Newark, I should say, and corruption, political corruption. They've had several mayors, have went to jail during that era. They said, you don't leave the mayoralty in Newark. There's only two ways: by death or by going to jail. So it was the bringing in the fight was seen as an opportunity to shine Newark's image a little bit, and so the powers that be, at the time, New Jersey had a very connected commissioner of boxing, and he working with a new promoter, they were able to piece it together and secure licensing for Rocky, and they scheduled the fight at Rupert Stadium, which was a minor league ballpark in the Ironbound section of Newark. It wasn't the greatest facility or the most modern facility, and it wasn't that large. It typically only set 15,000 or so, but they doubled the capacity, and they put the fight together, and they had it scheduled for June 9th of 1948, and they really promoted the heck out of it. The fighters went for the weigh-in at City Hall, and met the mayor, and as I say in the book, there were over 400 press passes issued. There were 40 Western Union guys, 7 movie cameras, all converged on Newark, and the radio broadcast was done by Mel Allen, who was the Yankee announcer at the time, and broadcast to 450 stations around the world. So it was a big event.
Yeah, and unlike, there's two differences between this third fight and the previous two. One, there's actually footage, which you can see. And number two, unlike there's like the dips and troughs of both fights, this one was a bit more dominant performance, but not by the person who you think would be dominating.
Absolutely. Once again, Rocky was a big favorite in the third fight. Zale at the time was 35, although they were telling everyone he was 34. And he was an old 35 in terms of all the fights that he had. He had about 100 amateur fights, and then, another 80 professional fights. And so the thinking was that Zale was too old. He had faded in the second fight, and that Rocky was just coming into his prime. Rocky was 6 years younger. I believe he was 28. And so Rocky was lodged as more almost a 3-1 favorite. In terms of how the fight unfolded, for whatever reason, Rocky's management decided to try to change his style, which was a very aggressive and just to press the opponent and try to land his big right hand, which was his big weapon. In the training, they were emphasizing his left hand, and Rocky was just strangely passive in the first round. To the extent it made any sense at all, the thinking was that he was trying to tire Zale out just to survive, the first few rounds, and then Zale would get gassed and he'd knock him out. But Zale wasn't, waiting around, for that kind of a result. And Zale went very aggressive, knocked Graziano down in the first round and was giving him a terrible shellacking. And then actually hit Rocky after the bell. At the end of the first round, the crowd noise was so loud that the referee didn't hear it. And some people thought that a right hand landed by Zale to Rocky's heart really influenced the final result. In the second round, Rocky came back a little bit toward the end of the round, and he won the round on the card, but it was a close round. And then the end came in the third round. And as you said, this is you can dial this up on YouTube, the fight, and Zale nailed Rocky with a tremendous left hook, and it was all downhill from there. I mean, it was a real furious assault by Zale and a pretty vicious knockout. He floored Rocky again. Rocky got up, but was badly hurt, staggering all over the ring. And Zale finished him with another right to the side, and then a left hook to the jaw. Rocky was out cold for several minutes, and they said they could have counted to 1,000, and he wouldn't have gotten up. And that's the only time that happened to Rocky in his career. Sugar Ray Robinson knocked him out, but he was up, right after the 10 count. So it was quite extraordinary that Zale could polish him off in that fashion.
So one thing I forgot to mention beforehand is the winner of the third fight was contracted to fight Marcel Cerdan. So obviously that's going to be Zale. And what surprised me a little bit was the fight, I think, took place about 3 months after the third fight.
That's right.
And not that many people knew about Marcel Cerdan. Obviously, I think there were rumors at the time about his private life, having his affair with Edith Piaf. But the third fight took place, and in a way, what happened to Zale is what he did to Graziano, but on a longer scale. And that's when his hard fights really did catch up with him.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think the American press and Tony Zale underestimated Cerdan. Cerdan had beaten several American fighters, Williams, and then Georgie Abrams. So they should have given him the credit he deserved, but for some reason they didn't. Zale really paid the price. There is a film of that fight, and it's very one-sided. I mean, Cerdan is very aggressive, and Zale just seems out of sorts. He didn't know how to handle Cerdan's aggressive style. Rocky was aggressive, and Zale usually did better against aggressive fighters, but Cerdan was aggressive in a way where he did not leave himself open to a counterattack. And, Zale just had a hard time getting off. He was getting beaten to the punch. His punches sort of lost their steam as things went on. And he just survived toward the latter rounds. And then finally, at the end of the 12th round, he collapsed and couldn't come out for the 13th. And Cerdan won a shockingly easy victory. And that was Zale's last fight. His own managers, he wanted to go on. He wanted to get another crack at Cerdan. He had a contract that gave him a right to a rematch. He actually exercised it, and the fight was scheduled in the Polo Grounds. But his managers very much discouraged it. They told him they were no longer going to represent it if he went ahead with it. They were concerned about his health. In the locker room after the Cerdan fight, he was very confused and more than typical when a fighter gets beaten like that. So there was that, and coupled with his tremendous age and all the fights that he had, he had absorbed a lot of punishment from Rocky, who was like a monster puncher. The thinking was, enough is enough. Finally, reason prevailed, and Zale retired.
So Zale's retired. As for Graziano, he fights on for another few years. And then, as you say, I think his penultimate fight was against Sugar Ray Robinson. He actually knocked Robinson, because I've seen the fight, he actually knocks Robinson down. And then Robinson gets him towards the ropes and knocks him out with a tremendous left hook. To see how big he is, if you watch it, Graziano's gum shield actually comes flying out, and he's out cold. Yeah,
it's Rocky won another 21 consecutive fights after the Zale fight. He doesn't look as impressive though as he did during his knockout string that led to the title. He wins a couple of fights toward the end in a desperate comeback. The fight with Charlie Fusari is the one that comes to mind in that regard. But finally, he gets a crack at Robinson. He was actually as he was wont to do, Rocky was sort of popping off in the press that, Robinson didn't want to fight him. And so Robinson, who acted as his own manager, actually called Rocky's manager and said, I'm sick of hearing this BS from this guy. Let's sign up the fight. And then Rocky was, having second thoughts maybe, but his manager told Rocky how much money he could make. And Rocky had a very serious attitude toward money. So they signed up the fight. And, it's actually a pretty competitive fight for the 3 rounds. Like you said, Rocky floors Sugar Ray Robinson. And Robinson said he hit me as hard as anybody. But Robinson, within a minute of being knocked down, knocks out Rocky in a classic combination. And like you said, his mouthpiece went flying out, and he just put him into another world. And if anybody has a question about how great Sugar Ray Robinson is, I would recommend that clip, because it's pretty awesome.
Yes, indeed. And Rocky, after that, I think he might have had one more fight, which he lost after that, and then he retired. He actually became a bit of a celebrity as well, because he had his own show on TV and done all his appearances. And he's almost like a second career in the entertainment world.
Absolutely, yeah. He went on TV, and he first worked with Henny Youngman, who was a stand-up comedian, the king of the one-liners. And Rocky would play sort of a dim-witted straight man to Henny Youngman, and their show would fill in on boxing was quite popular on television at the time, but the question was, what do we do if there's a quick knockout? How do we fill the rest of the hour? And what they came up with is they got Rocky and Henny Youngman sitting in the wings, and they would just put on like a live act to kill the rest of the hour in the event of an early knockout. And it was a sensation. People loved Rocky. Henny Youngman then got a better gig and he left, but then Rocky landed a television show with Martha Ray, who was a star at the time. She's sort of completely forgotten today. And Rocky again played sort of her, dim-witted boyfriend. Rocky, who had a very self-deprecating but a very good sense of humor, said I was told they were looking for an idiot like Rocky Graziano, so I figured I'll throw my hat into the ring to see if I can land the job. And he got the job, and not only on a weekly TV show, but he also became a very successful pitch man. He was doing commercials. I remember him doing commercials when I was a kid for Midas mufflers and stuff. So he maintained his celebrity for years. But probably the biggest, cultural impact that he had post his boxing career was his book, his autobiography, Somebody Up There Likes Me, which is really a phenomenal book. And they made an A-list movie out of it. It's the movie that made Paul Newman a star. That you still see that movie on, Turner Classic Movies to this day. And, I hadn't read the book until I read it in connection with doing research for my book. And I was really astounded how raw and blunt it is for a book from the mid-1950s. It's almost shocking, one scene after another of, the depravity that he lived in at the time. I mean, I sort of had the impression he was a juvenile delinquent, but he was worse than that. He was a real violent criminal, and but he lays it out in a very honest way, which it's admirable. It lends you to admire him for being so blunt, and no hedging, no excuses. Just very brutal honesty.
He had that film, Somebody That Likes Me. Obviously, he talked about Paul Newman, which I think the role was originally for James Dean, wasn't it? And then he passed away, and then Paul Newman took his place. And with Paul Newman, and I'm going to get onto Zale because it's two are connected. Zale was going to play himself, but unfortunately, he went a little bit too far with the scenes with Paul Newman. So, can you explain a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. So Tony Zale really struggled after his boxing career to find a second career. He tried doing entertainment like Rocky, but it wasn't a success. He had a restaurant that flopped. His marriage fell apart, which was particularly painful for him. So he was really struggling. And when they decided to make the movie, based on Rocky's book, Rocky, who was very generous, reached out to Zale and offered Zale the role to play himself. And the director and the producers were not crazy about the idea of they didn't know if Zale could act, but Rocky convinced them to do it. So it comes time for them to do the fight scenes in the movie, and it's Zale and Paul Newman, the movie star, not a fighter. and so according to Zale, Newman got a little frisky, was trying to, quote, knock his block off, close quote, and Zale, nailed Paul Newman with a body shot. And, Zale was a notorious body puncher. Newman doubled up, and Newman said, that's it. You got to fire this guy. We can't, I can't work with him. He's a scary guy, and I don't want to deal with this. So Zale lost that plum gig, which was a shame because he could have used the money. A bartender who had a remarkable resemblance to Zale, and the guy happened to had fought a little bit in his younger days. So the substitute, they found for Zale, the guy who played Zale in the movie, looks pretty much like Zale. So and the fight scenes are pretty good in the movie version of Somebody Up There Likes Me.
So finally then, and it's been actually a pleasure talking to you, how do you think Zale and Graziano are viewed in the current day?
Yeah, I think there's a feeling that the general feeling, I think, in the boxing community is that they're probably overrated, that their fame is overstated because of the popularity of their trilogy. That even at the time, they may not have been the top two middleweights. Most people, almost everyone, I think, thinks LaMotta was better. Certainly, Sugar Ray Robinson was better. Cerdan. So I think in that respect, their reputations have suffered a bit. I tend to take a different view. I tend to be in the camp that they fought in an era which is known as the golden age of boxing. It's known as that because of the depth of talent that was in boxing at the time. The argument goes that times were tough, especially in the Depression and with World War II. So better athletes tended to go into boxing than what we have in a later time when times are better. There's more affluence around, and a better athlete will avoid boxing if he can, go into some other sport. And I subscribe to that theory. And as a result, I think when you look at their records and you put it in context of all these great fighters that were out there at the time, especially in the middleweight division, they're two great fighters. I don't think either one of them's in the top 10 all time of the middleweight, but Zale is probably on the cusp. And Rocky was a champion, and he beat a lot of good fighters. So, and he was his knockout record is it can't be argued with. He was a knockout artist and just a devastating puncher. So I tend to think both of them are in the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and they both deserve it. They're two great fighters.
Ron, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. What I'm going to do in the description for this video, when this goes up, I'll add a link where you can buy the book as well. All right.
Thank you.
All the very best with the sales of the book, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on this podcast.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. And I watched a couple of your other podcasts, and I really enjoyed them. And so I do appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, cool. All right. Thank you. It was very nice of you to say so. Okay, thank you very much. All right, you take care.
Bye-bye.